All right. So today is about learning how to use what's called an HTTP only cookie. And we're going to see how we can combine this with the tokens that we've used for Django authentication to make our applications more secure. If we have time, we will get to deploying this change live onto AWS, but I'm going to start out by building it locally because we can actually get pretty far with that. But we will kick off just with a brief review of everything we did yesterday, because I think that will be useful just to help reinforce that. And there were a lot of steps. And then we're going to talk about why are we doing this? Why do HTTP cookies matter? We're going to have to make some changes to Django settings PY. We're going to have to make changes to Django's sign up, login, and logout logic. And we're also going to have to configure our axios in our React app to use HTTP only cookies. So it's going to really focus on implementation of this HTTP only cookie feature. And then if we have time, we will deploy code to AWS. And this is something that could be useful to do either right away in your personal project or right at the very end. Which is why this is an optional lesson, but this is really good to know about so you can be more aware of some of the considerations around authentication with a full stack app and some of the security advantages of HTTP only cookies. So any questions before we dive in? Cool. And let me actually make sure I've got Whiskey questions pulled up here as well. All right. So we actually did a lot of stuff yesterday, and I'm not going to get into the details because I know it was a little painful debugging live. I'll kind of write it up and share it next week. I did eventually sort out the issue with Nginx. So we were able to end up yesterday with on AWS with this domain name that we registered with AWS Route 53. We have our front end application up and running. I should be able to sign up. And if we look at the network tab to kind of watch these requests and log in. And remember, we had to change in our front end code the URL that HTTP requests go to. And we see we get back the token. And this is what we're going to be changing today. We're not going to be getting a token back in the body of our response. It's going to be sent back in the response as a cookie. And I should be able to even create a to-do list if my luck is holding. And log out and log back in. And there was a lot of ground that we covered to do this. We created an AWS account. We started to learn about the AWS management console and the pains and joys of navigating it. We created an AWS EC2 instance, which is the AWS term for like a Linux virtual machine. We saw how if we want to, we can use Instance Connect to have a terminal running in the browser that lets us interact on the command line with this AWS, or we could SSH in. And we learned a little bit about setting up and creating an SSH key. And then once we logged in, we had installed and configured Postgres, Python, and everything on this virtual Linux machine running Ubuntu on the AWS cloud. And we also set up Nginx to be our front-end server. We set up GUnicorn so that Django can run in a production environment and handle lots of requests. And we finally hooked up Nginx to pass API calls from our front end back to Django. And then we used an AWS Elastic IP to make sure that our EC2 always has the same IP address, and connected it to our domain name, which with what's called an A record. And so earlier on, and this was where I struggled, this Elastic IP did not exist. And then once we made it, we were able to, using Route 53 with the domain name that we'd registered, create a record for it, connecting our domain name to this IP address that will now always stick around. And Luis and DJ also pointed out this really cool service, DuckDNS, that we could use to get a domain, sort of a subdomain here, like my.duckdns.com, if I don't want to pay for a domain name, which is quite understandable. And so now if I wanted to, I could use this domain name here. If I can not get lost in the tabs, instead of this one with Route 53. And then finally, we used certbot to create an SSL certificate so that we can have an HTTPS requests going on with a secure socket. Actually, I want to say SSL maybe stands for Secure Socket Layer, which is the standard these days for internet requests, which is why when our front-end app has HTTPS here, it'll work and our server can handle it. And this is a good jumping off point for what we're going to dig in today, because we're talking about security. So why are we doing this? Why do HTTP only cookies matter? So token authentication has some pluses and some minuses. And remember, token authentication is where I now have, and I should log in so we can have our token so we can look at it. I'm going to make a login request to my server, and the server is going to send back a response. And in that response is this value token. And remember, both in our JavaScript code, if we go to utilities, JSX, we wrote all this logic yesterday, or excuse me, on Monday, that gets the token from the body of the response and saves it in local storage and adds it to Axios. And then the token ends up in local storage over here, which there's a good amount of security. Like if I open up, if I go to some other tab, like just for example, I think I'll close the AWS one out. Just like over here on the DuckDNS site, in some other tab, if I go to application and I look at local storage, I do not see that same token in here. The browser enforces that level of security. So if some JavaScript was running maliciously from the DuckDNS site and tried to do local storage.get token, unless it's, excuse me, local storage.get item token, unless DuckDNS has sent back and added something to local storage that's called token, we can't access it. The browser enforces that separation between tabs and between windows, between sessions. Well, over here, I absolutely can do local storage.get item token. However, what happens if somehow an attacker gets some malicious JavaScript onto our website? which is what's called a cross-site scripting attack, then their malicious JavaScript could run and grab our authentication token. And if instead of a to-do list app, this is, Chase Bank or something like that, that could have really negative consequences. So token authentication has some pros and cons. Auth tokens, because remember that what happens with token authentication is in these requests, like let's go to lists. In the request headers, there's this request header named authorization that has this value token, and that's how our front end app, our React app, passes the auth token to our Django API server. And this method has been around for ages. It's simple, it's reliable, it's flexible. If, say, we wanted to write a mobile app or a command line program or some other kind of program not running in the browser to interact with our Django to-do API, we can use this exact same kind of authentication without a problem. However, the fact that it lives in local storage does expose some security risks, like the kind of cross-site scripting attack that I mentioned. So this is kind of where HTTP only cookies come in. And a cookie is just a little bit of information. It's really a bunch of text. If you imagine like just taking a Python dictionary and turning it into into text, or like JSON with little key value pairs, that's all that a cookie is. And they're passed back and forth on every request automatically by the browser. And just like we can look at local storage, we can also go into our browser and look at cookies for a session. And in fact, we see that Django has created some cookies here for us related to handling like cross-site cores, cross-origin stuff, a session ID, and so on. Duck DNS undoubtedly has a bunch of cookies. And as you all may be aware, cookies are classically used for tracking, because the cookie is saved in your browser. And every time I go to, say, Amazon.com, my browser will grab whatever cookies are here associated with this domain and send it to Amazon, and Amazon can send stuff back. And so we see here, there's something here for analysis and all these other things. And again, I know this stuff looks a bit scary, but if we look at the cookie in the browser, we see there's a name and a value, and then all this other information is about the cookie, the domain that it's from, HTTP only, which is what we're going to be using today, and some other things. And there is probably a way to just view the cookie as text only, but I'm not certain how to do that off the top of my head. We can probably do it in the console somehow. Cookie store dot get all. So I'm not going to play around with it too much, but let's see, AWS. Let's just do maybe AWS dash user info and see if we can get it. So it looks like it returns back a promise, so we have to deal with it a bit more, which is fine, and we're not going to go down that road too much right now. But the important thing about what's called an HTTP only cookie is while some kinds of cookies we can access in the browser, and actually let's have ChatGPT help me here, and I'll just ask it, how do I print a cookie in the browser console? Document.cookie. So let's give that a shot. and see what happens here with Amazon if we do document.cookie. So this actually is a good example of what a cookie looks like. And we actually see that over here, all of these individual things, they're all part of one big cookie where it's just a name and a value and a semicolon. Name, value, semicolon, all in text format. So this cookie, obviously, we can access with JavaScript just fine. However, what we're going to make today is an HTTP only cookie that the browser will not let us access with JavaScript. And that then makes our applications more secure, because even if some malicious JS ends up on our site, they can't access the HTTP only cookie. So I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions before we start writing some code. All right, let's write a little bit of code and see how far we can get. So there's a number of things we're going to have to do here. The first one is we are going to have to configure a number of Django settings for HTTP only cookies to settings.py. And actually, that stuff we're going to come back to later. And I actually am just going to have today's lesson up as a reference, because especially with configuration stuff, like a lot of this is going to be copy and paste, but also this will allow us to talk through it. So I am going to go ahead and make some of these changes. I'm not going to make all of these changes because I want to actually be able to test this out on my local machine. So right now I am writing and editing code for the to-do app that we were deploying yesterday and working at earlier in the week on my own computer. We're not going to be touching AWS or EC2 yet. So I'm just going to get rid of some of the things that we don't need here and go to settings PY. So allowed hosts, we had changed this yesterday to 0.0.0.0, which refers to the machine running this. We only made that change in the code. I'm on a different branch now that does not have that change. So we still have star for all allowed hosts. And because I want to get some of this working with local development, I'm going to leave this unchanged. But so this was from yesterday. Now that we have everything set up, we could make this change on our EC2 and this would be fine, because we know that Nginx and Django are running on the same machine, and Django, we really only want Django listening to requests from Nginx. Same with cores allowed origins. I'm going to not make that change right now and still allow all origins for cross-origin requests. And then the two things that are critical for HTTP only cookies are these two settings right here. Session cookie secure and session cookie HTTP only. And this first setting tells Django to, oh, actually, I do apologize. This one I need to leave off as well, because it depends on the cookies only being sent over an HTTPS connection. And while we used certbot yesterday to set that up with our live application running on the EC2, we don't have an SSL cert for my local dev, and very often you don't for local development. So I am not even going to add that one. I'm just going to add session cookie HTTP only that says, hey, Django, when you send like a cookie for a session, make it an HTTP only cookie, and that will add and that then, because it's an HTTP only cookie, is making like our authentication method more secure. And I am going to go ahead and spin up my my full stack app on my local machine to make sure that, and I always like making sure that I'm making the changes to the file that I think I am, just to make sure everything's working. And I need to go into the backend directory. I already activated my virtual environment for this project earlier, and there aren't any migration changes that happened from yesterday, so we should be good to go to just run the server. And I was messing with this a little before, but let's go ahead and run my local dev server as well. Actually, I do want to open up, and let's open up one more tab here. And I think there was a tweak I made to our axios code in the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and check that out real quick to see if there's anything I need to change. This is what we're going to add in just a minute. So this is actually the one line that we need to add to use HTTP only cookies, I believe. And I'm actually going to look this up to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly in the Axios docs and I'm not giving a bad explanation. And if we poke around here, this tells us if we want like cross-site, cross-origin requests should be made using credentials. And so we probably do want that to be true. And then we'll now be always sending around the HTTP cookie, I believe. So I don't want the live hosted Vite app. I do want the one on localhost, and let's see if we're up and running. So now I've got that same application running on my local machine. There is almost definitely, in fact, I'll go ahead and log in here with an account I made recently, just so that we can have, and it looks like we ran into a CORS error, and let's see what the CORS error is. Probably I'm jumping the gun with this because we have not set that up. That very well may be what's going on. And there we go. So I got a little ahead of myself, which does point out there are a couple gotchas that we can run into when making the switch from using the auth token to a cookie. And we're going to see that in a minute too with some of the issues that can happen if there is a token in local storage. So we'll come back to this in a minute. And now let's go ahead and start building out more of what we need. So we've configured Django, right? We've updated the settings PY. I am gonna, I think, make the change now in my front end code. Well, we'll come back to the front end code later. Actually, let's focus on the Django stuff. The next step is we need to use HTTP cookies instead of the auth token when we sign up and log in. So we set, I believe it was session cookie HTTP only to true. That was our major change. Next up, we have to update our Django view logic to use HTTP only cookies. So basically, everywhere where we created or deleted a token, we'll change it to use a cookie. And what we'll see is that we still make the token, but send it back to our front end in a cookie, not in the HTTP response body. So we're going to have to change sign up, and I think I'll start with login. Let's do login, log out, and sign up. So these are the three things that we need to change. There will be some other changes that we need as well, but we can kick it off over here. So I am going to go ahead now and in my backend app, go to the user app where all the user logic is for signing up and logging in and so forth. And let's start adding some stuff that we need to do for cookies. So one of the really useful things about HTTP cookies is that you can set an expiration time on them by default, so that after 6 hours or 6 days, the cookie is no longer good. And because we can set that by default when we create the cookie, that makes it more secure because it means it's less for us to think about in our code and less for us to have possibly go wrong in our code. So we need a couple date and time related libraries that are going to help us set our cookies expiration time. And time delta means change in sort of math speak. So this is going to help us calculate like an amount of time that's changed. Brian, yes, sir.
You might have a typo at the top with date time.
Oh, I totally do. Thank you so much. Awesome. I appreciate that. So some of this is going to be unchanged for logging in. The user still needs to send their username and password. We still need to run this authenticate function to authenticate the users and password to get the user. And we still only want to log in the user if we have a valid and authenticated user. And that was some older code there, so we'll remove that. We still want to run this login command, I believe, because that sort of is how Django kicks off a session to manage sessions. And we still want a token. We're going to use an auth token, but we're going to send it back in the form of a cookie. So we are going to first set the lifetime, how long our cookie will live for until it expires. And this is where these two nice utilities that we imported are useful. Right? I'm saying get the current date and time, add 7 days to it in it's probably some sort of object, like some sort of date time class that holds date and time information. But we do now need to format this into text. So that the browser can understand it, and because the cookie itself is text only, so we need this amount of time in a text format. And I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this, but this is, and in fact, I would have to look this up. And in fact, we can throw this into ChatGPT in just a moment to see exactly what format this gives us back. But if you haven't seen this, the more you work with date and time libraries, you'll see like these percent signs. And this is going to indicate A, B, and A, D, and B. I don't remember what they mean, but capital Y is year. H, I'm pretty darn sure is hour. And then as you can see, like we've got minute. And so each of these percent signs is going to be replaced with some text. It's sort of like string interpolation. And a time zone, which so for real applications, time zones can be tricky. Setting the time zone manually is probably a good idea because the user could be in one time zone, our server could be running in another, our database, depending on its default setting, even if it's running on our server, might have a different time zone. So hard coding has the benefit of making it simple. And since we just want the cookie to live for a set amount of time, this makes sense. So now we can go ahead and we're going to actually use the cookie. But I actually have to create my response first and add the cookie to it. So I'm naming this variable with an underscore just because I don't like having it be response, even though because it starts with a lowercase r, it's a different name than this. It's too easy for me to make a typo. Like one underscore is often used to indicate like a private variable or method. But like if another programmer sees this, they'll kind of understand that, hey, this underscore is here just to make this name a little different from this. And we don't want to pass back the token. I think I will go ahead and add, we never added the email before, and it's probably not the worst idea to do that. So I am going to go ahead and just add the user email there. And now that I've got my response, I do want to add the cookie to it. And the Django response class has a set cookie method. And we're going to pass a bunch of key value pairs that will go into our cookie, like we saw in that crazy big text example before, where a cookie is just a text file with, you know, key values on the left and right sides of an equal sign separated by semicolons. So each of these, I believe, well, actually, we set the key here where we give it the name. And now here we set the value. And this is going to be the token object that we create when we made the token has this property key that has the important bit that we care about. We are going to make our cookie an HTTP only cookie right here by setting HTTP only to true and secure to true as well. And actually, I'm not 100% what this secure setting does for a cookie. So I think I'm going to ask ChatGPT. What does Django response cookie secure equals true to? So this says that should only be sent over an HTTPS connection. And then the browser will only include the cookie in requests that are made over HTTPS. So I may actually leave this out because for local development, I do not have an HTTPS connection. So I'm going to make a to-do note to myself and point onto AWS as we have HTTPS set up there. And we'll say secure equals false. So for local dev, I can get the HTTP only. I did try this out earlier. I don't think I actually ran into an issue with secure equals true, but since we don't have HTTPS set up for local dev, I am going to go ahead and skip that step. And then lastly, there's a setting called same site. And actually, I'm going to use ChatGPT to help me with this as well. And as the name sort of implies, and you may have been able to guess, same site is indeed involving cross-site, cross-origin requests and possible cross-site like request forgery stuff. And I'm pretty sure lax as in like a loose, less secure setting. So it allows safe cross-origin requests like GET requests or loading resources, but it doesn't allow unsafe requests, cross-origin requests like post requests. And this should work okay for us because I believe we've already set up our core's logic. So I think we should be okay there. And then finally, and I know we're kind of running out of space here. So let's actually make a little more room. We set our cookie lifetime. And here's where we can use the lifetime, like that date time string format that we created. And in fact, I have a typo here, strf time. And in fact, let's just ask ChatGPT what this %A, %D, %B is doing. So I do think it's great. I mean, I would just be Googling this and finding this on Stack Overflow. But ChatGPT most of the time is faster and is usually correct. And so here %A is weekday, %D is the day of the month, and B is the abbreviated month, is what those items are. So now we've gone ahead and we've set our cookie. And now we can actually return our HTTP response that has the cookie set on it. And so now I'm using a cookie when I log in. Oh, and Landon, thank you so much for the heads up about the typo. I eventually got there, but I very much appreciate the heads up. So again, a cookie is just a bunch of key value pairs in a text format. And the one thing I want to mention about this expires is this is the expiration of the cookie and not the auth token. So if we needed to deal with token expiration, we actually would need to handle that logic still in our backend application. Tom, yes, sir.
Hey, so, sorry to interrupt that. Just
No.
when I was running my unit tests, the time delta parameter, it's throwing an error. I think that the day is supposed to be days.
Oh, I very possibly could have made an error there. Like so.
Yes, now they're bouncing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I apologize about that. So now we should be cooking. And actually, this does raise a good point, which is we're going to need to do something very similar for signup because we're going to need to create a cookie. So in a minute, I think what I'm going to do is move this logic into like a helper function of some sort, so that I only have to fix my typos once. But before we do that, let's go ahead and let's update some of this logout logic so we can sort of think through and see all the changes that need to happen in our flow. So when a user gets logged in, we create the token, we add it to a cookie, we send the cookie back instead of the auth token in the response. When a user logs out, we still need to delete the token, but now we also want to delete the cookie from the response. Because the cool thing, the good thing or the bad thing about cookies, depending on how you look at it, is that like once the cookie is attached to an HTTP request, the browser keeps track of the cookie and sends it on every request back to the server. And I'm not sure if we need, probably that session cookie setting that we turned on in Django is what makes sure that Django always sends the cookie on every response. So when the user logs out, we want to get rid of the token and we want to get rid of the cookie. So again, I need to make a change to the response object. So I'm going to grab it and just do response.delete cookie, and my cookie is named token. So I'll put that there. If I wanted to get fancy, I could even make this like a variable somewhere to avoid typos and get a nice hint from VS Code, but I'm not going to worry about it too much right now. And return the response. So now logout should be handling the cookie correctly. And the next piece we want to change is sign up, because sign up is also where we create a token and send back a token. And I don't want to do that anymore because like we made the change here, I want to send back a cookie. So I think the simplest thing is probably just to copy and paste this code, though I think I will make a little helper function. I think I'll make a helper function that will do this stuff and add it to some sort of response object. And I'm just going to write it at the top of this file for simplicity. So let's name it create HTTP only cookie on response. And it's going to take in a response object. And let me go ahead and copy this code. And we're not going to use all of it, but we're going to use a good amount of it. Oh, and I apologize, that was very much the wrong keyboard shortcut. So that looks like the right indentation level. We set the lifetime of our cookie. I'm not doing this because I'm getting the response in here. And so here now I just have to set the cookie on that response and return the response. So fingers crossed, I'll add this into the login later. I don't want to touch code that I already wrote. But fingers crossed we can add it in here to sign up. Brian, yes, sir.
Sir, I think you just hovered over it. How
Yep.
is token being?
Yep, you're absolutely right. We also need to, I think, pass in the token. So I think that's the quick and dirty solution to how do we get the token in? We're just going to pass it in as an argument. There's probably a more elegant way to do this, but what this does let us do now is I can just do this. And I should even just be able to do return create HTTP only cookie on response token, because the response is already created and this returns it. So I do think I want to this could probably be a better named function, but I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of function renaming. But I think we're cooking now because I have this logic in one spot. I'm going to test this out once we have all the pieces. And if it's working, I'll use this function here in login as well. And then we just have our logic in one place. But so now we've updated sign up. We've updated login. We've updated log out to handle HTTP only cookies. There are a couple other changes we have to make to our Django code because if we take a look at our views, or not the sign up view, not the login view, but log out, info, and all of our to-do lists as well, we're using this helpful token rec class that's set to use token authentication. And we are going to have to change this. So that's what we're going to tackle after the break, because it is 10 till. So this is, I think, a good time to pause for questions and then take a break. So let me go ahead and see what's in Whiskey questions and then also see what's on people's minds. David, yes, sir.
Yeah, it looks like you left out that leading underscore when you returned response and logout.
Oh, thank you. I very well may have. Let me. Oh, yeah, I absolutely did. And the squiggly is there. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Yeah, I do make a lot of typos, which is why I get nervous just having a variable named response floating around.
Hey, Alan.
Landon, yes, sir.
Just wondering if you could show your settings py file one more time for what you included in it to
Yeah.
get the working.
Yeah, absolutely. So my change to settings py was actually pretty minimal. So that is literally the only change I made right now to settings py. Now, when we deploy this onto AWS, these are also the changes we would want to make. These two are because when we have Django running on AWS on an EC2 and we have Nginx on that same EC2, the only thing talking to Django is Nginx. Everything comes through Nginx, all of our front-end app requests. So 000 essentially indicating like this is the same machine is the only host that Django should be listening to. And then the cores allow credentials and session cookie secure are both, I believe, related to like SSL certificates and HTTPS, which we don't have set up for local dev, so I haven't added those yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Great question. Francisco, yes, what's up?
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you could demonstrate the process of a user logging in, or I guess signing up a brand new user, showing the cookie being generated, then logging out, the cookie being deleted from the browser, and then logging back in to see the cookie being repopulated.
Yes, although I'm not sure if it will work yet, because what we have not done is, where is it hiding? What we're going to get to in a minute is writing the authenticate function that overrides and that uses cookies for authentication. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but I'm on the same page with you for sure. That's where we're headed. Once we get that hooked up, then that's where we're headed next. Yeah, and that is a good preview of what we're gonna do next. We're gonna sort of hook into how Django Rest Framework does authentication to tell it to look for the cookie, to tell Django Rest Framework, hey, the cookie's in this, excuse me, to tell Django Rest Framework the auth token is living in this cookie. And that's what we'll take a look at after the break. And then I think what we'll do is very similar to this class, token rec. We'll make a class like HTTP only cookie rec or something like that, and do a little bit of replacement. And then we should be able to see the cookie in action. All right. If there aren't any other questions, let's take a break. And then, so let's come back at 5 after. And let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right. So just to recap, what we've done thus far is we've made some changes to our Django settings PY. There are more changes we'll need to make when we deploy this to AWS. And we've also changed our Django view logic for login, logout, and signup to use HTTP only cookies. And in fact, if I use the git diff command, I can see the changes I made to settings PY, and I can see the changes I made to the view function. Where again, the big thing is I now, before I send back an HTTP response, when someone signs up or logs in, I want to attach a cookie to that response. So I wrote this helper function to do that. And we're using it here in the signup. And just because I don't want to accidentally introduce a typo, we're not using it yet in login, but we wrote this logic first and it's exactly the same. And if everything's working well, we'll end up replacing that. And then if we go down to logout, we also now make sure to delete the cookie before sending back an HTTP response when the user logs out. And we still do have to delete the auth token because although our cookie has an expiration, that's just for the cookie, not the token. So the cookie's like, to go back to sort of the ice cream analogy with Django, the ice cream container is now the cookie and the authentication token is the ice cream itself, right? Like the authentication goodness. So there is one more step we have to take, and this class token rec here kind of hints at it. We are using this token rec class to tell a whole bunch of our view functions how they should authenticate requests. And right now we're using token authentication, which is looking for an authentication token. So there are a couple steps we have to do to implement a version of this for HTTP only authentication. What I eventually want is class HTTP only rec. We're going to make something like that. But before we can do that, we do have to actually dig under the hood of Django Rest Framework a little bit, because we have to leverage some of what it provides us. So this code here, let me bump up the font size just a touch. This code here actually comes straight from Django Rest Framework's source code on GitHub. And you can go and see it here if you're curious. And it's very cool to see. And no, we don't actually enforce this in class, but this is actually like writing good comments like this in Python is super valuable, like doc strings like this. And this is a great thing to do in your personal projects so that when other people are looking at your code, they it makes it more readable and just indicates that you understand the value of this. So there's two functions here that we care about. This authenticate function and then this authenticate credentials function, which I believe uses authentication. And we're going to have to sort of leverage what Django does for us, but we're going to have to dig a bit. Oh, I'm so sorry. Authenticate calls this authenticate credentials function. So let's look a little bit at what Django Rest Framework is doing, and then we'll see how we can leverage it to our advantage. So what Django Rest Framework does to authenticate a token is it gets the authorization header from the HTTP request and it splits it. And it splits it probably based on the space. And then it checks to see if the auth token itself is indeed there. And remember that, does this let me type? Yeah, let's just go back to here. The auth token is in that HTTP request, it's like bearer space and then the long token name. So the token name is what we care about. And we see that being dealt with right here. And so once we've like determined that we have a valid auth token, what we then do is we run this decode method on it. And then if the decoding fails, we throw an error. Otherwise, we say, hey, we've decoded the token and it's valid. Let's call authenticate credentials. And we can see that method over here in the Django Rest Framework source code as well. And this starts to look similar to what we've done before with self.getModel, where we're grabbing a model, which is almost undoubtedly the user model that we've told Django is our user model that is hooked up to authentication. And we see here model object select related user get by key. And the key is indeed the token that we've passed in right here. And then we check if the token is active or not. Or excuse me, if the token user is active or not. If the user is not active, we throw an error. If everything is good, we return a tuple with the token user and the token itself. So our job now is to get the ice cream out of the container and into the bowl. We know that this authenticate function does stuff to grab a token and send it to authenticate credentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to write our own version of this authenticate function that gets the ice cream from the container, that gets the ice cream from our cookie and passes it on to here. And we're going to take full advantage of the joys of object-oriented programming to do this. And I am just going to kind of leave the lesson code up here as guide code as I write this out and we can talk through it. And I think I'll put this in a utilities class. And so I think I will just put that in the user app. I'm honestly not 100% sure where the best spot for this is, if it's in user app or maybe like at the top level of my Django project. But that's a bridge we can cross later. And if anyone, or like Francisco, if you have thoughts or kind of know what the best practice is, I would actually love to know that. I was doing a little research, but I didn't find it out because someone had a question about that as well. But let's go ahead and code this up, and we can always move it around. So we're going to import that token authentication class that we were just looking at. And because I haven't quite set up my VS Code right so that it knows yeah, one day I'll make these red squigglies go away from the Django Rest Framework, but I'm just going to double check to make sure I don't make any typos here. And we're importing that same token authentication class we were just looking at. here in the Django Rest Framework code. And we're going to import the Django Rest Framework exception class so that we can throw an exception if we need to. And we're going to write our own class that does authentication. But it's going to inherit from the token authentication class. So token authentication is now this class's parent, and so our HTTP only authentication class has all of its methods. So we need to get the ice cream out of the container. We need to get the auth token from the cookie. And thankfully, this is actually really easy. And again, this is sort of our helper method that we're going to use elsewhere in this class. The Django request object has a dictionary on it, essentially named cookies in all caps. And we know our cookie is named token. So we can grab it like that. And now we have a very nice method following the single responsibility principle that just does one thing. Now we are going to do what's called like overriding a method, or what is referred to as like polymorphism in object-oriented programming, which is a big fancy word for many different possible shapes for the same thing. I'm writing my own version of that authenticate method that Django Rest Framework's token authentication class has. And so when I'm done, we can pass this class around, and anywhere that we would be using the Django Rest Framework token authentication method, token authentication class, we can use this one because it'll have a method that's the exact same name. It just does something different. And that's called polymorphism. And you're also here referred to as sometimes like function method overloading. So we're overloading the authenticate method name with a new one. And because I've written a helper function, it's really easy to get the cookie, and our code is super readable. And I wonder if I don't have a typo, but it looks like it's an indentation issue. So that red squiggly is now gone. So we do need to check to make sure that the auth token exists. And let me get myself back into VS Code. And let me catch up on the chat real quick. Let me see if I can fix my Python Vim to see if I can make those red squigglies go away. Otherwise, I will worry about it later. And Francisco, thank you for the tip here. I keep thinking that when I select interpreter, like it says virtual environment, but it doesn't seem to be connecting it up. And voila, there we go. So if you've had these red squigglies, the solution is when your virtual environment is activated, use the which command line command to get the path to where Python is, which lives here inside my virtual environment directory. Copy that absolute path, hit Command Shift P to open up the VS Code command prompt, type Python select interpreter, and then paste that in. And this says, I got so confused with this before, but now we're working, and now this makes life so much easier. So jumping back to our authentication class that we're creating, we're writing an override method for Django's authenticate method. And this is our error case. If we don't have an auth token, we're just going to return none. It fails. If it succeeds, we can do return self.authenticate credentials auth token. We can use Django Rest Framework's authenticate credentials method once we've grabbed the token. So this is really cool. We get to look at Django Rest Framework's internals. We get to practice some polymorphism and method overloading, and now we have an HTTP only authentication class. And so now we do want to actually use this. And I'm going to leave that up there as guide code and do something slightly different, which is now here. I'm going to write class HTTP only request, or let's say HTTP only token rec. And this will inherit from API view. And here we will set our authentication classes, but not to token authentication, but HTTP only token authentication. Which it would be helpful if I imported it. So let's import the class that we just created. And now down here, we're using our version of Django's authentication class to do HTTP only authentication. And we set the permission classes as well. For the same thing, this one we do want to be is authenticated. So the nice thing about this is I can follow the pattern that I already have, because we're using this token rec class all over the place to set up authentication. And now I should just be able to replace this with this new one. And if I look around, I see it's only in these two spots to log in and for the info. So let's replace it in these two spots. And I do need to make sure I get the name right because those names are a bit similar. So
Adam, I think you're having some unexpected behavior because you inherited from the model app user instead of the model API view.
oh yeah, thank you so much. That was very much a typo. And Jordan, thank you so much for pointing that out too. Yeah, I apologize about that, folks. That was definitely autocomplete run amok. So eventually, in a minute, we're going to go into our other views as well for, say, tasks and replace this too. But I've actually written enough code now where I should be able to sign up or log in as a user using tokens. So let's give that a shot. So I'm actually already logged in. But if I refresh the page, I get an error. And if I hit localhost 5173, I get an error. And now, well, first off, let me actually start the server, which always helps. And let me confirm that my dev server is running. But I'm still getting an error. And if I clear the network tab and I take a look over here, I see what's happening is, and let's look at everything. All this stuff happens that I don't care about. We get the HTML page. We're familiar with this. I care about the API calls that are throwing errors. And I get this detail authentication credentials were not provided error. And if I look at the headers, I see, you know, the response headers aren't that useful, but the body's there, and that's a problem. If I look at the Django terminal, I see that the GET request went through, but we get unauthorized API users. This is a little bit of a tricky question, but does anyone have any thoughts as to what the cause of this error is? So this one is a bit tricky, and hopefully there is not another typo I have, but check out what I still have in local storage, this token, and check out, if I look at the request, what's in my request headers, my auth token. But I've just reconfigured Django to look for cookies instead, to look for a cookie that holds this token. And so I wonder if maybe the reason Django's throwing the error is because we're passing this authorization thing in the request header that really shouldn't be there anymore. And I told Django, I don't want you to look there. And Django's saying, hey, there's some authorization that shouldn't be here, and I don't like it. So let's delete this from localhost and refresh the page. And now we get what we would expect to see, right? I wasn't even logged in, but I was seeing that error because I had that token floating around in my browser's local storage. So I think that can be an easy gotcha, and just something to always kind of bear in mind and keep an eye on and check. And now let's see if we can sign up and if we can log in and see what that looks like. So I think I did Alice earlier, so let's create an email for Bob and use my favorite password of XYZ123. And this does seem to have worked. The sign up request is what we would expect. I'm still getting the response back on the token, which actually tells me that maybe I missed something in my sign up logic in Django, because we don't want to send the token back. So I'll go there in a moment and check to get rid of it. But let's look at cookies. So here's what I want. The response cookies, there's all these things, but here's the token. I see it starts with 1C, blah, 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 blah. And over here in the response, I actually see the token has the same thing. And that gives me the confidence that indeed I have passed my authentication token in what is hopefully an HTTP only cookie, right? And if I go to application now and I go to cookies, I don't even see that one here. And if I do document cookies, it's undefined. And so I'm still getting this error because there's a little change we need to do to our front end code so that we're still putting this token in local storage in our front end code. So let's go ahead and fix both of these issues real quick, but we've at least seen that sign up works and sends back a cookie. So first, let me go to my front end code. And let's find everywhere that we're dealing with like cookies. User confirmation is going to need to change because it's looking in local storage. User registration is going to need to change. And the easiest thing here, I believe, is we can just get rid of local storage set item because we're not going to even get back a token anymore. So we don't want to put it in local storage. And we don't want to set this authorization header in our requests either, because the cookie will automatically be passed on by the browser. So both of these, in fact, all of these really should be able to go away, and we can just return user. And I think for the moment, what I will do is just leave them commented out, just in case there is something that I'm missing, and then we'll come back and delete it later. But I'm pretty darn sure. So now our front end code should not be passing anything into local storage for registration. Let's do the same thing here for logging in. Let's do the same thing here for logging out. There's nothing local storage or cookie related here. And then over here for user confirmation, we shouldn't need to look in this at all anymore because we should be able to get back a cookie. So this may need some more changes. I think I'm going to circle back to that one in a minute to make sure that I'm grabbing the cookie correctly. Though again, actually, we should be good to go here because the cookie is passed. And if the cookie's passed, this will succeed. And if there's no cookie because we're not logged in, this will fail. So here, really, what I should be able to do, and I think I will just delete this stuff because otherwise it gets a little too messy, is well, we just try to make a request. If we have the cookie, it'll succeed. If we don't have the cookie, it'll fail and we'll return null. Now let's hop over to our Python views to see what I missed in signup. And this was where I used this helper function. But if I look over here, this is the line of code I forgot to change. We don't want to send back a token anymore. So we've made a number of changes. We're not sending back a token in the response body when a user signs up. And our front end code shouldn't be doing anything with local storage. In fact, I could even do a global search for local storage. And all of the code in my whole project involving local storage I can see is commented out. So I now I can be sure I didn't miss anywhere in my front end code dealing with local storage that I need to change. So let's refresh this. Though it would probably help if let's actually see what our errors here, because I may have one other issue going on. And I suspect what's happening is maybe this, or maybe I missed and I still have an auth token hiding somewhere, even though I thought I got rid of it. So let's see what this network request looks like and what I missed. And we see we send a GET request. We're expecting it to be unauthorized because we're not logged in. We're not getting any headers back, or we're not sending authentication to any of the headers. And let me make sure that I'm using the HTTP token rec everywhere I want to. So I think this actually may be an issue with the front end routing, where we're maybe not handling gracefully this initial request that we make to get user data. Tom, yes, sir.
Is it because we're doing the user confirmation on load, like with the loader? And
Yeah.
so that function is trying to grab credentials when there's none there yet.
Yeah, I think I think that is very similar to what's going on. Though that was working for us before. So I think there is. That's why I didn't want to quite get rid of this stuff entirely. If we look at user confirmation. So let's take a quick look at where we're using this in the router to see what changes we need to make. And with the loader. So here's where we're using the loader. Here's where we end up going to the error page. But I would have thought we end up getting sent back to our homepage. So I think we could either I wonder what happens if we just do this. Okay, so that works just fine. And so this is where we run into a problem. Though I wouldn't have expected this to throw an error because we're still getting a response. Brian, yes, sir.
Just a shot in the dark, sir, but what if you tried adding a object after the .get users first argument with credentials true? I'm just curious if that might help.
Oh, with
Adding like an object after that, give it a second argument, with credentials true might help.
that is a good idea, to be honest. I am a little shaky on exactly what with credentials is doing with Axios. In
Didn't
fact,
the payload come back and say credentials were not provided from the network?
Say that again.
In the network error response for the fetch or for the get, didn't it come back and say in the payload, didn't it say?
Yeah, it did say that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take you off on the wrong track.
No, I think that's a good. You may be on the right track, though. I think with credentials, if we use ChatGPT, I do remember I was looking at that earlier. I want to say it's related more to SSL. But let's see, no, ChatGPT is saying allows you to control whether to include cookies in the request and response. Tells Axios to include cookies in cross-origin requests. So I think you're absolutely right. And we absolutely do need to have that set and with credentials true, because we should always be sending a cookie if it's there. So we do want with credentials true. Let's kill and restart the dev server just for sanity. And I think also do like a hard refresh. And let's see. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of all of these cookies, though I don't think that will cause that's the source of the issue. It should be okay that we're getting a 401 unauthorized back. To be honest, I'm a little thrown that we're not gracefully handling it right here, because I feel like we should just be able to, or excuse me, in user confirmation, I would have thought, like, so what if we get an error response back? We just return null, and that should not break anything, as we see here. But I think that like Axios or maybe React Router is doing some sort of automatic behavior with when we get an HTTP response back with an error. So let's see here. We get back a 401 unauthorized. Because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to, in the loader, handle the 401 error. So I think probably the issue here is I was missing like a try catch. So let's try wrapping this in a try catch block and see if that helps. Because I think what's happening right now is it's either Axios or React Router. Like it, when we get this error response back, it's hooking into some built-in behavior. So let's get rid of all this stuff we don't need. So we have a nice clean bit of code to work with. And let's make this a bit bigger. And let's add a catch for the error. And let's add a console log. User confirmation error. And if I don't get this sorted out in 5, I think we should just take a break and I'll fix it offline. And what we're going to add in, hopefully here in a minute, is a redirect. I do need to grab that. Because we still want to return the user data. But let's see if this helps with this issue at all. Like my goal right now is just to get this console log message, because that will tell me that we're going into the catch. And that will help me debug the problem and know I'm at least on the right path. So this is interesting. It's working and we're getting the user confirmation error. So it looks like it's Axios. If I remember, Axios probably, I think, does handle, like, have some automatic behavior around errors. And really, I probably should have added a try catch in there on Monday. If I was to do a sort of root cause analysis, I should have added the try catch the first time with this. But at least we get to do a little debugging and sort of see it in action. And hopefully that's useful. And, you know, it makes sense, I think, that we're getting this network error. Hopefully once we're logged in, we don't get it anymore because we now have a cookie. But let's see if that's the case or not. So I think this as is actually okay. Because returning null in this catch block appears to have Axios and React Router handling this gracefully and doing exactly what I want. I go to the home page. So let's see if we can sign up, log in, log out. So I already did Bob. Let's do carol@gmail.com. And so this does look like an issue where we are running into an error. I wonder if with credentials, let's see if this even made it to Python. So it made it partway to Python. The options HTTP request was sent in Django, but then it ran into a problem. And this error message in the console is saying, access the HTML HTTP request from origin, localhost has been blocked by CORS policy. Response to pre-flight request doesn't pass access control check. The value of the access control allow origin header in the response must not be the wildcard star when the request's credential mode is include. The credentials mode of the request initiated by blah, 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 blah is controlled by the with credentials attribute. So long story short, the fact that we have CORS allow all origins set to true, I think is not playing nice with credentials. Now, I think we want credentials on because it did appear that that is what makes sure it sends cookies every time. And if we kind of look over through their docs and we find with credentials, I didn't realize that credentials means specifically cookies. I think that's what escaped me earlier, but the internet and ChatGPT seems to confirm that. So the solution here is sort of following the guidance and advice of the error message, which is actually giving me a solution. If we look at the network response, this access control allow origin header, that is CORS related and set by the server. And I believe related to this CORS allow all origins policy. So if we go ahead and change that to not allow all origins, but we set it instead to probably just localhost 5173 for now, I think we should be good to go. And I am gonna actually use ChatGPT to help remind me. Django settings CORS allowed origins. And that's what I was looking for, then to make sure I had the right name. CORS allowed origins. And indeed, let's try HTTP localhost or 127.0.0.1. I don't think I need the port number. I don't think I need to add localhost instead, but if I run into problems, those will be my next steps. So let's clear the console and clear the network tab. Refresh again. And let's try creating an account for Carol. So it looks like the response is still coming back with what I was not expecting. No access control allow origin header is present. So this is probably a typo that I made because now this access control allow origin header isn't there at all. So let me make sure I'm using this correctly, and then we'll go from there. And it doesn't look like I made a typo in the name. I'm seeing CORS allowed origins.
Did it have something about headers below that in the chat GPT response? The Django cores headers?
We should have this installed already. But so there's cores headers. And it should already be installed in the middleware. And here's cores middleware. So that should be set up because we were already using it. We were just allowing everything.
I've noticed sometimes the cores middleware, the order matters, and I always just put it at the very top. I don't know if that matters, but
You know, that's actually an excellent point. I think we wanted it after the session middleware, but maybe we don't now, or maybe that has changed. Django cores middleware before or after session. So I'm pretty sure we'd want it after security. But maybe not. And actually, Brian, I think you hit, so before the session middleware. And in fact, they put it before the security middleware. So I may have made a mistake there, and you may be on the right path, Brian, because what's happening maybe is we hit the security middleware or the session middleware, and then that's throwing back the problem. So let's see if this does it, and if it doesn't, then we will break and I'll fix it offline. And I do have to restart the Django server when I change settings PY, or well, the Django may be doing it in dev mode for me, but I do it just out of habit. And I'm going to take a quick look in applications to make sure I don't have any undesired cookies. There shouldn't be anything in local storage. So, and just to be safe, let's use a new email and see if we can solve this. And if not, it'll get fixed offline. No, we're still running into a cores issue. Now, I'm pretty sure if we just make like with credentials true, go away. No, yeah, let's take a 10-minute break. I'll fix it offline and then walk through whatever the problem was and the solution, because it is undoubtedly it is almost definitely something related to this. The last thing I'll try is let's add like localhost. Let's add localhost 5173 just to be safe. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break, folks, and I'll get this fixed up. And we're almost home because this is really the last step here. Because once we have this working, all we have to do is this HTTP only token request class. The same way that we're using it here now for logout and for info and for so on, we'll use it for all of our view functions for the to-do lists, and then we'll have cookie authentication everywhere. Brian, yes, sir.
in your core settings that you just adjusted for localhost, I can't remember, are you using HTTPS for this or still just HTTP lines 33 and 34?
HTTP.
Okay.
This should all be HTTP because it's all on localhost. Yeah, that's a good thought, but unfortunately I don't think that that's the issue. Let me go ahead and pause the recording and we'll take 10. I'll keep debugging on this for anyone that wants to stick around. And then when we'll reconvene, we'll keep on moving. All right. So Landon and Nika, thank you both so much for helping me with this. I had made honestly a very straightforward mistake. What was missing in settings PY was this one line, or is allow credentials true. And I apologize because actually I made the same kind of mistake twice, which is actually kind of good to point out because I have noticed like there are certain kinds of errors we make when we're programming. And I definitely made the same category of error. We had this right here in the beginning of our Django settings. And right at the beginning of the lesson, I was like, oh, this is stuff related to SSL and HTTPS. And I said the same thing about with credentials true for Axios. And I got both of those things totally wrong. And I made a bad assumption. And it turns out that here, credentials really means cookies, basically. So this is about allowing cookies on cross-origin requests, which we obviously want Django to allow because we've got our front-end app running on another server. And then this is about Axios always passing an HTTP-only cookie, which we also obviously want as well. So with credentials true, and then here with cores allow credentials, along with the change to cores allowed origins that the original error messages was telling me about, we've now got sign up and login working. And so just to demo this, and we can kind of look at it. If I want to sign up, and I'm just going to start with Z and move backwards. I can now sign up and I'm logged in. And if I look at the request, we get back exactly what we want, a 201 created response. And then if we look at the response payload, I must not be passing the user email here, but if we look in the response cookies, we see our token in the response cookies. And now if I go to application, I see my token cookie right here, which is exactly what I want, which is awesome. And if I go to local storage, I see there's nothing there. There's no token there, which is now also what we want. However, unfortunately, there is another issue I'm now running into, which is interestingly, I'm unable to log out. And so what's going on here, and I haven't been able to fix this one, is the cookie is not being sent. I'm like 90% sure that the cookie is not being sent to the server when I try to log out. Because if I go here and I look at the request, and I look at request cookies, there's this CSRF token, but that's for something else for cross-site like forgery protection. The token cookie that I created is not being sent at all. And so Django understandably is saying, hey, I don't know who the heck you are. I can't log you out or log you in or do anything with you. And here I do admit I am a little bit at a loss because we have configured Axios to send HTTP only cookies. I even went into the sources tab to look at the JavaScript that we have in the browser to make sure that it's the most recent version, that this is there. I was trying this out too, which does the exact same thing, but another way. And it doesn't seem to result in the cookie being sent, unfortunately. So that one we are a little stuck on, and I've kind of been trying various approaches with no luck. I do wonder if the request headers, maybe we need to add something to the request headers. Though I am not totally sure, to be honest, because I've just been digging around a bit here. without luck, and I'm not sure I want to. There is one more thing we can try. No. There's a GitHub issue I was looking at to try and figure out if there's any issue. It does look like we need some of these request headers, like access control request headers, content type, access control request method to be set in the request. And maybe that is part of the issue. I'm a little hesitant to try and keep debugging this live. So I think what I'm going to do is work around this a little bit. I'm just going to demonstrate logging in and show the other places we need to touch our Django code to hook up cookie-based authentication for to-do lists. And then we can wrap up early. And if folks want to stick around, I'll keep debugging and working at this. So as a sort of a hack to demonstrate logging in, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the cookie. And this is good to learn. This is actually super useful when doing full stack development, is to get comfortable with using dev tools in this way. So let's try logging in with the account that I knew I could create. And that works great. And again, we get our cookie back. But logging out, not so great. Something is making its way to the server, but the server is not liking it, probably again because the cookie is not being sent. And we can see, interestingly here, Axios gives us all of this great config information. So we can actually see all the details of the request that's being sent. Base URL data, headers. So based on that GitHub post I was seeing, I suspect maybe there's a header I need to add here to the Axios requests. But I think I'll circle back to I'll circle back to that one. Though I will give our curriculum a check to make sure that there's nothing else that I'm missing here. But I think, yeah, I'm going to circle back to that one. And I think what will be useful is let's just see how we can hook up cookies to the rest of our Django app. So we've already seen this done successfully, somewhat with login and log out. Though I suppose actually, like, possibly the issue here is this HTTP only token class, because that is the class that we're using for authentication. Though I really think the issue is just that the cookie is not being sent. I don't even think it's getting here in the middleware. So let me just show real quick where else we're going to use this. What I'm just going to do is a global search for token rec. And this is the class that we've been using for authentication all over our code. And so I see here in views.py for our to-do lists, we need to replace this with HTTP only token rec. And it's as straightforward as that. And now to-do lists are hooked up to use the HTTP only cookies as authentication. And now I see I'm importing it and I'm using it here for tasks, right, in the tasks app. So let's do the same thing. And now I see also, this is where I defined it in the user app. And it looks like I've pretty much gotten it everywhere, because, here we go. Nope. it's all taken care of because it's all part of this thing. And in fact, I can, I'm sure there's a way to do an exact match. I don't know off the top of my head. There we go. Whatever this AB button is, toggles exact match for my global search. And I can see that it is now only in one spot where I define it, and this class is no longer used, when we can leave it there for historical purposes. So that's literally all we need to do to get it all hooked up. Unfortunately, the issue seems to be that we're not sending the cookie on requests. So we're not being able to use it successfully. So I might try to debug this a little more, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because I'm not sure that that's a good use of time. So this might be a good time to pause and check in and see if there are questions around the login flow with cookies and hooking it up that we can talk about. And then maybe we'll do a little bit of debugging. Okay, cool. So it's let me go ahead and pause the recording.